Good evening. Are you all able to hear me clearly? So I'd like to start by thanking the organizers, of course, BIC for the invitation, the whole team, Vikram, Nazneen, Sandhya. I hope I'm not forgetting someone. My friend Vikhar, who put me on to this opportunity, and to Jahnavi Phalkey for agreeing to do this conversation, and to all of you in the audience for coming here. A special thanks to the Mokshagundam family, who is also in attendance, and I'll talk a little bit about how they helped me when I was going about this book. So I'm going to start by reading out an abridged version of the book's introduction so that you get a flavor of the book as well. And I'm very conscious that I'm carrying coal to Newcastle because there are many people in this room who know a lot about Sir M. Visvesvaraya, who know more than I do about certain aspects, who have lived through the legacy that he has left, especially for Bangalore and for Karnataka. But I hope that some of the things that we will touch on will give us some fresh insights as well. Mokshagundam Visvesvaraya was easily the most famous Indian engineer of the 20th century, but he was also much more. 6 decades after his passing, there's scarcely a walk of life in India that doesn't bear in some form the imprint of his work, not only as civil engineer, but also as public administrator, constitutional analyst, and economic thinker. If you've picnicked in the Brindavan Gardens near Mysore, if you've studied in the IISc in Bangalore, or Mumbai's Institute of Chemical Technology, which used to be UDCT, if you lived through the heyday of the Planning Commission, if you were a farmer near Pune or Mysore, if you're a Hyderabadi whose drinking water comes from the Himayat Sagar or Usman Sagar, or if you swear by Mysore sandal soap, you have experienced directly a part of Visvesvaraya's legacy. He was born in a village near Bangalore, Mudenahalli, in 1861, around the time the British Crown took over from the East India Company. Visvesvaraya began his career as a public works engineer in the Bombay Presidency, where he spent a quarter of a century. And while this fact is known, I think we often forget the importance of the fact that he spent such a long time in various parts of Bombay Presidency before coming back to Mysore. And that was formative in many ways for him. As a government engineer and later as a consultant, he contributed to the design, building, and maintenance of large irrigation works, dams, and urban water supply and drainage schemes across the length and breadth of the subcontinent. As he approached the age of 50, he accepted the position of chief engineer and later Diwan or Prime Minister of the princely state of Mysore, his home state. Here, he pursued ambitious public works projects as part of a program of industrialization and modernization. He was instrumental in the inauguration of the gigantic multipurpose dam on the Kaveri, the KRS, the institution of the first university in princely India, Mysore University, the establishment of several industries in the state, most notably an iron and steel factory at a time when there were hardly 1 or 2 other factories in the entire country, and the founding of a bank and a chamber of commerce in Mysore. In retirement, he placed himself on the All India stage. In addition to being on a number of committees related to engineering and technical education, which we would expect, he developed a distinctive vision for national development. So we can see here some of the many committees that he was part of, very prestigious ones, some of them. And you'd expect, I mean, it's not surprising to see that he was on the board of Tata Steel Company or on the committee for technical education in Bombay. But what is interesting is that he was also a member of or president of the Indian Economic Congress in 1924, which was the premier conference for professional economists in the country. And it's quite astounding that an engineer was able to command that kind of respect and influence from professionally trained economists. So much as to be invited to be president of that conference. He was also a member of various inquiry committees, the Back Bay Reclamation Project, which was a bit of a fiasco in those days, and he was on the committee appointed to figure out how to set it back on the right path. And later he was president of the All India Manufacturers Organization, an organization of small and medium manufacturing enterprises. So he was one of the pioneering proponents of economic planning, 5-year plans, And of course, as is well known, a tireless campaigner for Indian industrialization. His slogan, "Industrialize or Perish," is very well known. And he was indeed motivated throughout his life by the goal or the dream of seeing a rapidly industrializing India. He promoted his ideas on economics and national development through a number of books, such as Reconstructing India, published in 1920, Planned Economy for India, 1934, Nation Building, 1937, and Reconstruction in Post-War India, 1944. This is only a representative selection. There were many, many other books written under the aegis of the AIMO and other organizations which talked about various elements of development which made up his vision. As scholars have argued, Visvesvaraya's vision, with its emphasis on large-scale industry, technical education and planning, formed a precursor to Jawaharlal Nehru's nation-building program after independence. Both were part of the same cohort, one of the earliest ones to receive the Republic's highest civilian honor, the Bharat Ratna. And of course, Sir MV had his differences with Nehru towards the end of his life. So in the 1940s and 1950s, he felt that the Nehruvian vision had gone too far in favor of the public sector. He wanted less controls on the private sector. He was not so much a fan of the socialist leanings that were exhibited. But having said that, with hindsight, the similarities in their visions stands out rather more than the differences. And this is an interesting picture to stay with for a moment, because one of the arguments that I want to make in this book is that studying Sir MV's life in detail is not only a way to understand one person, but it's a lens on a larger story, the story of modern India. It would be no exaggeration to say that his life mirrored the emergence of the nation itself. He was born, consider the span of life that he lived. More than 100 years. He was born after the uprising of 4 years after the uprising of 1857. He came of age when colonial rule reached its zenith. He was in his 20s when the Indian National Congress was formed. He was in his 50s when World War I shook British rule in India. He was nearly 70 when Mahatma Gandhi led the Salt March to Dandi. By the time he was done with the business of life, Sir M. Visvesvaraya had witnessed not just the coming of independence, but also the first 3 general elections and the first 2 5-year plans of the new republic. Today, he's enjoying a resurgence as a national icon. His memory is invoked frequently in the context of nation building. His birthday is celebrated, of course, has been celebrated for many years as Engineers' Day, but it's, I think, achieved even more prominence in the last few years. Metro rail stations have been named after him in Delhi. You can see Motibagh here, and Bangalore, of course. Educational institutions across Karnataka and other parts of India bear his name. So do government schemes, scholarship schemes, research professorships, awards, and so on. You're all very familiar with Sir MV's status in Karnataka itself. He has long been deified. Statues, busts, and portraits of the former Diwan are to be found in public parks, residential localities, street corners, shops, factories, institutions of various kinds. The photo on the left says Annadata Visvesvaraya, and it's from a temple in Mandya district where the people are very thankful for the KRS scheme and other interventions which turned the area into a sugar belt. And on the right, this is the statue outside the Institution of Engineers Bangalore chapter. And even Google carried a doodle on his birthday in 2018. Now, part of Sir M. Visvesvaraya's appeal lies in his image as an apolitical technocratic champion of development. Technological solutions to challenges of governance enjoy wide popularity today. At the same time, there's also increasing public debate on the limits of some of these visions, especially from the viewpoint of what we know today about sustainability in the environment. So there are debates around the pluses and minuses of large multipurpose dams, of large-scale industrialization as a route to poverty alleviation, and to the extent to which we need or do not need economic autarky, which is to say complete self-sufficiency, in order for a nation to be prosperous. In this context, the need for a deeper understanding of Visvesvaraya's life and a nuanced appreciation of his legacy in all its shades is growing more urgent. There are other reasons too why it's time for a reappraisal of his career. Despite his renewed ubiquity as an icon, he remains a cipher to most Indians. We're all familiar with his frail, turbaned face, which is, we see on many book covers, in iconography and paintings and elsewhere. But that only tells a little part of his personality. We tend to know fewer details of his career and contributions. We know the highlights, but we don't know the stories behind them. And when he's highlighted, he's seen often in narrow terms, as an ingenious engineer or as an uncompromising administrator. But I'm going to argue that there were many other dimensions to his life as well. He was also an important figure in India's political history. And I think this is slightly counterintuitive, because I just mentioned that engineers are often seen as apolitical figures. But he was, as I said, at the center of nationalist politics, even if he was not visible on center stage. And he's one who deserves to be studied as seriously as Nehru, Gandhi, Ambedkar, Tilak, or Bose. He was deeply involved in the vital constitutional debates of the day. He negotiated with viceroys and maharajas. He played an important role in the fortunes and outlook of the princely states. In the 1920s, he was even a spokesperson of what's called the States People's Movement, which was a movement on behalf of the citizens of the princely states who were demanding more democratic rights from the maharajas, which is quite interesting given that he was working for a princely state himself earlier. And so he was able to span many different positions. In many ways, he was an honorary member of the Indian liberals, the intellectual descendant or descendants of Dadabhai Naoroji, you see on the top left. M.G. Ranade, who you see on the top left, and Dadabhai Naoroji before him. Visvesvaraya was a close associate also of moderate Congress leaders such as Gopal Krishna Gokhale at the bottom there, Madan Mohan Malaviya, and M.R. Jayakar. The last two are cartoons drawn by an artist called Emery Kellen, who was present at the Round Table Conference in the 1930s when all of these people went as delegates. And he has a wonderful series of cartoons, not only of each delegate, but also of all of them sitting around this large table. And it's quite fascinating. So it's a really important, I think, chapter to focus on Visvesvaraya's work with Malaviya and Jayakar. I'll say more about this perhaps in the discussion, but suffice it to say that they were interacting for several years, pushing for something like a roundtable conference before it actually happened in the early 1930s. The engineering side of Visvesvaraya's career also requires deeper analysis. He's popularly thought of as the greatest or even the first modern Indian engineer. But there is a puzzle to be solved, because we know that there were also several other engineers at this time. You can see R.N. Mukherjee on the left, whose firm built the Victoria Memorial in Calcutta. You can see Lala Gangaram on the right, who's known as the father of modern Lahore and was a philanthropist. You can see A.N. Khosla in the center, who was head of the Central Water Power Commission and also associated with Bhakra Nangal. So there were many other Indians who were prominent as engineers, but nobody achieved the same stature as an engineer in the public mind as Sir M.B. So the question is, how do we understand this phenomenon? How do we understand and account for this larger-than-life image? In what specific ways did his career as an engineer shape his ideas on industrialization, economic development, and social reform? So that's the second question. He had this long career as a professional engineer, and then he transforms into something that is larger than that. How does the first part influence the second? Were these beliefs already developing when he was a public works engineer, or did they mainly result from the tours that he went on, visiting Japan, Europe, and America? How did he construct his claim to authority and expertise in diverse fields? So in other words, how does an engineer get economists to listen to him when he talks about economics? Finally, we know very little about the man himself, his strengths and his foibles, the conflicts and negotiation involved in his career. Icons are always in danger of becoming caricatures. The public's understanding of his historical role is shaped largely by reverential accounts, anecdotal history, and indirectly by his own autobiographical writings, which are useful, but he was very reserved, so he doesn't talk about certain things. Placed in the pantheon of national heroes, he has ceased to be a person. So if we are to do justice to Mokshagundam Visvesvaraya's life and career, we must peel back the layers of the public persona. What made this idealistic and fastidious personality tick, who seldom appeared in public without a full suit and white leather shoes and Mysore turban? was almost never photographed smiling but obviously had a sense of humor, who refused to meet visitors without an appointment, who apparently shirked publicity as a person while publicizing his ideas throughout his life. What gave him his unshakable belief in the possibility of turning India, with its bewildering diversity of peoples, into a melting pot, a uniform, homogeneous, modern nation? These were the questions that I set out to explore in this book. I decided I'd pay close attention to the engineering side of Visvesvaraya's life, because it's a bit of a paradox that he's known as an engineer, but a lot of accounts, popular accounts of his life, tend to skip over the engineering part very quickly and move on to the other things. So to the extent possible, I wanted to go into that. I wanted to look at his training, his possible influences, how he thought about irrigation, what was his philosophy. I also wanted to understand his experiences in this phase, and as mentioned this, how these experiences influenced his thinking on developmental issues later on. Second, I wanted to stress the historical context in which Visvesvaraya worked. He was clearly an outstanding personality, but we need to understand how an outstanding personality is made. What are the influences? What are the interactions? What are the experiences? How does one mold oneself into that figure? So I wanted to understand the prevailing trends in engineering, for instance. So if we think of Visvesvaraya as a prominent engineer, we must know also what was happening around him in the field of engineering and how he built on that or pushed it forward. Third, I wanted to bring to life the intellectual and official engagements with other people that shaped his life. So in the book, I try to spend a lot of time talking about various other characters, the industrialists who were his friends, Vittal Das Thakursi, Walchand Hirachand, and many others, his bureaucratic colleagues and subordinates, many people who we worked with in Mysore, some of whom opposed him, some of whom supported him, the teachers of his youth who influenced him, and the Diwans of Mysore who preceded him, and of course the royals of Mysore under whom he worked. Finally, I decided that the book's narrative would be firmly anchored in primary sources. We've all seen lots of WhatsApp forwards and unverifiable stories, some of which are very colorful, but we can't really, tell whether how much of it was true and whether it is meant to illustrate some larger truth or whether it's really fact. And I think even the basic facts of his life have sometimes become fuzzy over many retellings. It's like Chinese whispers. We say something again and again and again. And so I resolved early on that one must prioritize contemporary sources. And of course, that's the job of a historian. You have to go and look at newspaper reports, official documents, letters, memos, triangulate between all of them, because some may have different perspectives. You need to look at how they all mesh together. And so I searched for such sources. They exist in archives and institutions in Delhi, in Bangalore, in Mysore, in Mumbai. So we talk about the erstwhile Nehru Memorial Library in Delhi, the Institution of Engineers, the State Archives of Maharashtra in Mumbai, the British Library in London. And I also tried to retrace his footsteps, spending time in different cities, going to the Deccan Club in Pune, which he helped to start, etc., to get a sense of atmosphere and the places that may have molded him. And finally, I spoke to people who knew him and who have met him and who were extremely kind, invited me home and spoke to me about their experiences as well. So I'm going to leave it there by saying counterfactuals are never easy, but it is hard to imagine Indian history without Mokshagundam Visvesvaraya. His legacies are many and varied. His story is also the story of irrigation in the subcontinent, of princely India in a time of great flux, of technology and industrialization in an incipient nation, of the conundrum of what it meant to be a scientific Indian. That is the story that this book tries to tell. Thank you.
So, in the first instance, thanks to the Bangalore International Center for agreeing to let me be the interlocutor this evening for Aparajit's book. It gives me a huge pleasure to be doing this, not least because Aparajit and I have in a way grown into history of science and technology together. He was just about finishing his PhD when I was doing my postdoc, both of us at Imperial College in London, and so it's wonderful to see that, after, so many of us managed to finish our first books because those come out of our dissertations, and I'm one of them. And the projects managed to kind of, cross that and produce his second absolutely fabulous doorstopper. So congratulations hugely on writing the book. I have greatly enjoyed reading the book, not least for the incredibly meticulous and elegant use of language. And for that, again, I think you must sort of, take great pride in it, because it's lovely. It's lovely to see a thick, dense book in history of science and technology that's also quite beautifully written. So with that, I'll sort of, stop the foregrounding of what we're doing and why, and just get into the meat of it. So, Aprajit, you have in your first book written about the consolidation, rise, emergence of engineering as a profession in India. And I think it might be, therefore, for both your own earlier work, but also for the reasons for which you ended up writing this book, for us to hear a little bit more about Visvesvaraya the engineer, which also, in a way, tells us more about his years before Mysore, which would be probably most interesting for us here today, this evening in Bangalore, to understand the sort of nature of his work, the nature of his training, but also the kinds of friends he made while doing that work in Pune and Bombay.
Thank you so much, Jahnavi. Thanks for the very kind words. I'm glad you enjoyed the book. And I'm really glad you're doing this conversation. Jahnavi is really very, very busy because she's the director of the Science Gallery here in Bangalore. And many of you may have visited it, wonderful programs. And she's doing this in the midst of a lot of engagement. So I'm really, really glad that she's here. And I can think of few better people to have this conversation with. So, Jahnavi, I'm really thankful that you brought up the question of engineering, because, as I said just a while ago, that's a part which we tend not to go very deeply into. So I think I wanted to understand a couple of things. One is, what is the larger organizational culture into which Visvesvaraya stepped when he became a PWD assistant engineer in Bombay in 1884? The age of 23, around 22, 23. So, the larger organization of public works at this time is something that I worked on in the earlier book that you mentioned. And it was a culture dominated by British engineers, who manned most of the upper echelons of the engineering profession. It was a profession which was dominated by public works, railways, and the military. And it was a profession which was racially divided. So there were British engineers, there were Indian engineers educated in India, and then there were subordinates. And the Indian engineers, even if they did the same kinds of work, got lower pay and lower privileges. And there was a prevailing culture of what made a good public works engineer, which consisted of a few elements. One of them was that an engineer had to be a generalist, a person who's capable of doing many different things. Cannot be tightly focused on only one kind of task. The other was, and it was always a he at this time, the other was that he had to be a gentleman, a man of character. And what the British meant by this was something very diffuse. It meant somebody who would not be corruptible, somebody who could take challenging decisions, somebody who would not wait for, getting 3 levels of approval before taking a decision, especially when they were in charge of some remote region and so on. But the subtext was that Indians could master the technical aspects of engineering, but they could never master these other aspects. In other words, to become a gentleman, generalist, a man of character. And this kind of discourse was quite common in engineering at the time. In fact, around the time Visvesvaraya was in engineering college, there was the governor of Bombay, or one of the top officials in Bombay, asked various engineers to talk about their juniors, and there was a lot of a lot of worry about what would happen if Indians got promoted to a point where they would have to give orders to young British engineers coming in. So this is the environment in which he steps into this into this profession. And I think I asked this question of why he stands out from the others. And I think one answer that I got through my exploration was that from very early on, he stood up to these stereotypes, and he mastered some of what the British considered essential elements of a good engineer. He was very efficient. He was neatly turned out. He was outspoken in his views on technical matters. He was not afraid. He was very concerned about not saying something out of turn as a government servant, but he was not afraid of contradicting his superiors on matters of policy or technical judgment, etc., when it came to it. So I think that those aspects of his personality were very important at that time. But how did he get there? And I think we need to look at the influential personalities in his life, and most accounts of his life have talked about the importance of Charles Waters, who was the principal of Central College in Bangalore, where MV did his first degree, which was a BA degree. It was a BA degree, but in science subjects. The major was mathematics and natural philosophy. But there's a section in the book where I talk about the syllabus at that time. And so they were also learning history, they were learning philosophy, they were reading Shakespeare, and so it was quite a rounded education. And after that, he spent 3 years or 2.5 years doing a licentiate degree in the Pune College of Engineering. And there, I think there's a lesser known figure who was very influential, and that was an Irishman named Theodore Cook. And it's important because the Irish members of the British officialdom had a slightly different view of colonialism. And Theodore Cook was far more supportive of Indians than many other people in his time. And in fact, there's an exchange where he fought with the government because there was a rule that there was only one job in the PWD reserved for the top graduate of the LCE program in the Pune Engineering College, in the officer level. And at one point, they added a rule saying that if that topper has not got a first class, then he can't get the job. And so there was this enormous correspondence that he's writing, and he's saying why this is so difficult to even pass this program, let alone get a first class. And he says some extraordinary things. He talks about the fabulous engineering works of ancient India and medieval India and all of that. And so he says there's no difference in aptitude and so on. So these were, I suppose, people from whom Visvesvaraya would have drawn strength. Unfortunately, we don't know too much about his classmates in terms of individuals. We do know some names who later became colleagues, etc., but their interactions at this time are difficult to trace. But the culture of the institution is something that I try to go into here.
So Prajit, if I may ask you just as a subset of this question, are there projects that Sir MV took up of note that you would like us to notice at this point of time, right? Like, so after Pune, after the licentiate, are there notable projects, and to what impact, right? Like, and what were the motivations? What do we understand from that?
Yeah. So, the early part of his career is slightly more difficult to reconstruct. This is happening in the late 19th century. Sources are fewer. But we do know that in his memoirs, he talks about it, a great adventure in the early part of his career when he helped to build a water supply program, a water supply project near Dhule. Which was one of his first postings in Maharashtra today. And he talks about how he had to swim across a river and so on. And so in those early experiences, he's learning a number of things. He did all of that. He notes that in the background, he was ticked off by one of his superiors because he said, I'm going to wait till the monsoon stops before building this siphon. And it's not taken kindly to. And then he says, okay, I must do it. So it shows us a lot of things about how he was keen to uphold the sort of bureaucratic hierarchy in terms of following what his boss said, but he's also determined to make a good impression. So that was one. Those are many small projects. He was cutting his teeth on these projects. He had relatively independent charge of a water supply project in the city of Sakhar in Sindh. And that was in the early 1890s, I believe. And then he did some work in Surat and other places. He then also, I think the thing to note is that although there's there is a strong continuity in terms of his working on water supply projects, reservoirs, and so on, he also did many other types of engineering, as a generalist norm for PW engineers was. So he also worked on roads for a while. He also then became sanitary engineer for the Bombay presidency, which is in charge of drainage and piped water supply, and looking after things that so that there's no stagnant water and so on. Yeah. So he's doing a wide variety of tasks, and he is working quite early on with influential people. So one of the best known of his episodes of his early career, I won't really call it early because he was already 40 by this time, was the time when he was executive engineer in charge of the Pune irrigation district, and he designed an improved version of an automatic sluice gate for the Khadakwasla Dam. Yeah. Now, we can talk about the technical contributions in terms of there were other people who were working on it, earlier British engineers. It was incremental, each design built on the previous one, and he made some quite ingenious changes which would make it suitable for that particular terrain. But what's interesting is that once he did that, and in the process of doing that, he had to deal with pretty high officers. So every time a governor came visiting Bombay presidency, or Lord Kitchener, the famous military commander, came, they would be taken to see these gates, and he would accompany them. And then he was the person chosen to talk to the irrigation commission when it came in and talked about the problems of irrigation and so on. So I think early on his exposure to these high levels of British officialdom gave him a level of confidence that that came in useful later. As an engineer, in terms of his training, it's obvious he got the PWD job, so he was the topper in his batch. He was the person who got the highest marks. He was a very, very diligent student.
Is that why you chose to write about him?
Who does it remind you of? No one that I know. No, he was clearly a very diligent student, but I think the things that made him stand out were his project management skills. So in terms of getting things done on time and so on. In fact, there's a very interesting letter that was written by the public works examiner to him during the 1890s, which was a time of terrible famine in Bombay presidency. And Visvesvaraya was in charge of what were called relief works. He was helping with relief works. So there's large irrigation projects that were created in order to provide work for laborers, but then also, by the way, to help with irrigation. And so this public works accounts examiner writes a letter saying, it's amazing that your accounts in your office are up to date in this kind of very, very difficult time. But your staff is working 12 hours a day. So please, if you need an extra person to work for you, please let us know. Right? So,
it does remind us of some people, yeah.
Yes. So I think this is also an interesting time when there's a debate in what an engineer is in terms of education, both in India and in Britain itself. In Britain, for all the people up to the generation that was in charge when he was a student, they were not trained in colleges. They were trained by pupillage or apprenticeship to practicing engineers. And they saw themselves as practical problem solvers. And when the first graduate engineers came in, they were often seen as too theoretical, too bookish, right? Not able to get their hands dirty and so on. And in fact, the first major engineering college in England, Cooper's Hill, was formed in 1871 after they were formed in India. And precisely it was formed in order to supply engineers for the Indian PWD. But there continued to be certain reservations about these people. And there were lots of stereotypes about, oh, these Indians, they're really good at solving mathematical problems and differential equations, but they don't really know how to go and work in the field, right? So he fought those stereotypes as well. He was a mix of the two. I think he was a scientifically minded, theoretically minded person, but he was also very hands-on.
Now I think that gives us a very, very good understanding and an overview on Visvesvaraya's engineering career or his formative years. And I think the point that you note towards the end, which is that he was someone who was able to get his hands dirty and actually work on projects and manage them, is a skill that was what probably put him or set him apart from many people around that time. it also speaks in a tangential way to, the story of Chandrasekhar Venkataraman, who also was a bureaucrat for the first 10 years, after his master's degree in physics from Madras. And he is an assistant accountant and, and working there and also doing his own work. So bureaucracy and scientifically minded Indians, especially coming from the south of where we are, there seems to be something worth exploring.
Einstein worked in the patents office.
He worked in the patents office, absolutely. So I want to turn our attention to, in many ways, the next phase of Visvesvaraya's life, but let me come to it from a different angle and see what one might actually mine from that framework. So the early 20th century is sort of fairly one of upheaval, right? Like also in India, but all, across the world. So we have the very first World War. We have the October Revolution in Russia, or rather the Russian region, one might call it. We have the New Deal in the United States. The New Deal does for the United States in many ways, in a different manner, what happens in the Soviet Union, where a largely agrarian economy is taken and into the industrial age over a fairly short period of time. So it is in this context that here someone who's trained as an engineer managing large projects which are purpose-built, right? Like whether it's for employment during famines or irrigation in terms of improving agricultural productivity, but also addressing famines, etc. So here's him, and then there's Japan, which is extremely interesting because at this, we forget by the time of independence that Japan was a point of reference apart from Europe. Well, actually, Europe is, I don't even know where to place Europe, and so you're going to help us do that, which is, so the New Deal, the October Revolution, Meiji Japan, and the presence of Europeans. How would you place Visvesvaraya's forming thoughts? Well, they're not, they're fairly congealed by then, but his thoughts in relation to these happenings across the globe, because he's very much in touch, he's responding, he's thinking about them.
I think that's key, the fact that from an early stage, he's looking outward, not inward. He's not looking to maintain the status quo, he's always wanting to see change and see things move forward in whatever way he understands the movement at that particular stage of his life. And so he's devouring information from various sources. And in 1899, when he's in his late 30s, he goes to Japan for a few months. He makes detailed notes of what he sees there. It's the 30th anniversary at that time of the Meiji Restoration. And so there's celebration of all the things that Japan has achieved since then. And of course, as we know, in the early 20th century, Japan became a point of reference for revolutionaries, nationalists, not only in India, but in many other Asian countries, because here was an Asian country that was seen as standing up to the industrialized West, did not get colonized formally, and beat them at their own game, in a sense, right? Modernized, westernized, industrialized, and did all of these things in ways that appeared very, very impressive to anyone who cared to visit. In fact, in the early 1900s, there were several Indians who actually went to study various industrial subjects in Japan, including from places like Punjab and various other places. And Japan and America had the advantage in the Indian mind of not being Britain, in the sense that here were examples from the rest of the world where you could see and which you could aspire to emulate. And you could say these places are doing it better than the British are doing, which is very important for a people in a colonial situation to be able to say. And Ross Bassett's work about Pune in the late 19th century is very revealing, right? It talks about the Maratha and the Kesari and how they would have reprints of articles from Scientific American and all of these other, these journals. They would talk about, they would reproduce parts of the prospectus of MIT and say Indians should go and study there. Nobody knew about MIT at that stage. It was only 20 years old. But they said, this is the model you should go for, not the British model of education. That was the subtext, of course. And he was in Pune at that time. He was working with all of these people. So there's the Japanese influence, and he visits again in 1919. He takes detailed notes. He visits lots of professors and Tokyo Imperial University, talks to the Indo-Japanese association, which is a business sort of lobby, and which is headed by, at that time, by the Maki Okuma, who's the former Prime Minister of Japan. So he's very tuned to this. That's the first point. And he's also very interested in the Japanese model of village self-government, and takes very, very detailed notes on this. He's also interested in the idea of universal education, something that he tries to push in Mysore in the 1910s when he's Diwan, and something that Japan did very early on after the Meiji Restoration. So he's fascinated by all of these things. He's fascinated by all of these things, and he's also exposed to, as you said, the American example. His American travels come a little later. 1908 is the first time he's going to all of these places. But before that, I think the formative influence that I mentioned is his close association with the Pune Sarvajanik Sabha, the Deccan Sabha, Gokhale, Ranade, all of these people, the people he meets in the Deccan Club, which he helps to form as a forum for Indians and British to mingle in the 1890s, where he also makes friends like Srinivasa Shastri, who comes to join the Servants of India Society, and is introduced by Gokhale to Visvesvaraya. He's also meeting Vittal Das Thakursi and other people. He's meeting the who's who of the traditional elite of Pune, the nationalists, the colonial officials. So he's quite unusual for an Indian colonial bureaucrat in being comfortable in talking to people who could be seen as critics to some extent, however moderate they were, of colonial rule. And of course, Ranade is talking very, very passionately about the need to move from agriculture to industry, the need for government intervention to boost industry, which the British were saying we won't do because we believe in free trade. And then he was, so he was quoting all of these continental economic thinkers and saying, you can talk about mill all you want, but here are all of these other people who are saying that history tells us that in the nascent stage of industrialization, you need protection. And these arguments very much found the foundation of Visvesvaraya's thinking. He builds on them. He's very much in that line of thinking. So although he's not formally a member of any of these bodies, Sarvajanik Sabha or Servants of India Society or whatever, he's attending talks, he's listening to them, he's talking to them, he's comparing notes with Ranade after he returns from Japan. So here's the second major influence. The third, as you said, is the American and European influence, which I'm sure he was reading about much before he actually visited those places. But he went in 1908, again, a major tour, visits, Ford, GN, and goes and walks along the drains, the underground drains in Milan and other places. And he's not going to Milan and looking for the Duomo. He's not looking for the Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci. He's walking along the drain because he wants to understand how these things work. And I think so. He was a sponge. He was trying to absorb everything that was there, and he fervently thought that and wanted to recreate what he learned in those places. And of course, he didn't have the opportunity to do that until later in his life.
So, to just bring back the Soviet Union into the picture, because it is an important example for almost everyone that he is hanging out with or he is speaking with. I'll just turn the question a little bit to ask, not looking at the Soviet experiment or the New Deal as an influence, but as in terms of what does he think of those, right? I'll also tell you why I'm asking that question is because I also, in a way, could you help us understand, for example, someone who's actually working on the ground as an engineer, irrigation, water supply, making a transition towards thinking about industrialization and, later economic growth and nation building, not to say later in terms of it just comes sequentially in his career, but he's thinking about it already, right? And I'm packing too much, I know. But also, what is interesting is his journey from natural philosophy to political economy, right? Like he's studying natural philosophy for his first degree and ends up sort of with a cohort of people who are thinking about political economy, right? Like, so how does one map this journey? And is there use for these two examples, for example, or the ones that I mentioned, or is there something else that you can bring in? So how does one map that transition, and where do the Soviet Union and the New Deal figure in that?
Sure. I'm also going to pack a lot into the answer. So I'm going to start with the last thing you mentioned, which was that he moved to political economy. And actually, the most interesting thing that exemplifies this, and I'm not sure I mentioned it in the book, is that I found that he was a doctoral examiner for a couple of theses in Calcutta University sometime in the 1920s or 30s. Can anyone guess what the subject of those theses might be? Broadly speaking.
Jute plantations.
No, it was not engineering. It was about economic policies for industrialization and planning and things like that, right? So he was seen as the expert on those things by the time he was 60, 70. So I think that's a fascinating journey, as you mentioned. The Soviet example is very important for his ideas on planning, obviously, because by the time he's writing his book in 1934, the most obvious example before the world is the Soviet 5-year plans under Stalin. And of course, it's much before the worst excesses of Stalinist rule come to light. So people are admiring it. They're seeing it as an example of a traditional society that can rapidly industrialize, and how can they do this. And he's also he's quite eclectic in the range of examples that he draws when in the books that he writes on development and so on. So he's looking at thinkers from different places. He's not so bothered about whether or not he agrees with the ideology of those places. If he can find something that he can use, he thinks that it's useful, right? So, and that we can replicate it. So he's drawing from the Soviets, he's drawing from the Americans as well. But what's interesting about both the Soviet 5-year plans and the New Deal is that these ideas are not happening before his ideas. They're happening alongside or after, right? So in 1911, when they set up the Mysore Economic Conference, the idea is to collect statistics about the economy, and it's a nascent form of planning. They're not using the word planning yet, but the idea is that you can direct the economy in a particular way through your policies. So he's got that way of thinking already. It's developing, and then he sees international examples which legitimize that way of thinking. The other thing, the New Deal as well. I mean, if you look at the KRS, it's a huge multipurpose dam project, and it's 20 years before the TVA. It starts 20 years before the TVA, and of course TVA then subsequently becomes the inspiration for Damodar Valley and other things. So I mean, these things don't occur in isolation, right? These professionals are talking to people in other parts of the world. They're reading journals, they're reading magazines. He has visited the Aswan Dam earlier in Egypt. And he would be aware of it because it was, people like Wilcox, who were associated with the Indian PWD, also worked in Egypt. So there's a very direct organizational connection with what's happening in other parts of the world, and the British Empire especially. And so he's interested in all of these things. The other point is that he is coming to, I think we need to, if we broaden our perspective a little beyond Indian history and look at what's happening in the world, it's a time when the engineering profession is rising the world over. It's coming of age, it's got its origins as a formal profession in the 1860s, 1870s perhaps, and then it's becoming this very, very organized, networked, international, global profession by the 1920s and 30s. That's kind of the peak. When professional engineers are crisscrossing the globe. They're going to Brazil, they're going to India, they're going to other places. Even Indian engineers going to Uganda and other places. So it's a global fraternity. And he's learning from these things. A couple of my colleagues our colleagues in the history of engineering broadly have written a very interesting article where they point out that there was a point in the 1920s or 30s when there were at least 4 or 5 heads of state across the world who were engineers. In Mexico, in Britain in some form, and in many other places. So this is that was when the technocracy movement in the US also was taking shape, and the word was used in a much more specific sense than we use it today. So he's part of a global trend, of using the insights of engineering to think about larger societal problems, and so he's very much a part of that in that sense.
Yep. No, I think I agree with you that Visvesvaraya, to the largest extent, was with his times, at moments before his time as well. Because what we see in India, for example, there is a lot of thinking around it. So Meghnad Saha is another person who comes to mind around the same time, looking at similar contexts, arriving at probably slightly adjacent conclusions. Also, I mean, he's a physicist. Visvesvaraya is an engineer. And these thoughts then congeal in the National Planning Committee, which is the 1930s, when you have a massive exercise, right? Like, which of course is put on hold because most people writing those reports find themselves in prison after 1942, or between 1942 and 45, 46. Most of them come out in 1947. There's another interesting thing that happens in this period with the National Planning Committee, and it's 27 reports, I think?
29, I think, subcommittees.
Okay, so he would know better.
I may be wrong.
I haven't gone to the archive in 5 years. So those reports, alongside the People's Plan, the Tata Plan, and several other plans, and here's someone who's been thinking and writing about planning, and he finds himself in a context where he's surrounded by people who claim to be speaking for a plan or for planning and post-war reconstruction of India. How does he relate to? Because he's got other relationships with the same group of people, right? Like he's sitting on the board of directors for Tata Steel, so he's got a connection with that group of people. He's talking to them. He knows what they think. He's also, he's also interested in ideas that are otherwise not of this group, like the Japanese village self-governance idea. So here's Visvesvaraya in the middle of all of these groups. Tell us more. How does he relate to them in terms of how are his ideas overlapping, different, conflicting with this group of people?
I think what you've mentioned points to a larger theme of the intellectual history of interwar India, which is an incredibly fertile period of debate, where there are people talking about what we would today call national development from so many different ideological perspectives. I'm thinking of Ben Zacharyah's work, for instance, which talks about these debates in incredible detail. And also Raghavendra Chattopadhyay's work on the history of planning, where he actually talks about how even the colonial government was talking about planning, because it was so much in vogue, you had to use the word planning somehow or other to appear legitimate. And so the colonial government was talking about it. Industrialists like G.D. Birla, not only at the time of the Bombay Plan, but in the 1930s, were talking about planning. And Visvesvaraya at that time, 1934, publishes his book. And then, as you said, there's a plethora of plans. So people from different ideological backgrounds, they all can agree that planning is the thing. There's a wonderful quote by an economist named Lionel Robbins, and I wonder if it'll take too much time to find it, but it's a very picturesque quote. It talks about how people of different stripes, if at all there's one thing they can agree on, it's that the world needs planning. But what they mean by planning is different, right? There are some common points, but there are some different points as well. And so the People's Plan, for instance, the Marxist revolutionary M.N. Roy and his friends are creating this People's Plan. And in fact, one of the most prominent critics of Visvesvaraya's planning came from a co-author of the People's Plan called G.D. Parikh, who was an economics professor in Ruia College in Bombay. And he came from a very, very Marxist perspective. And he said that, this idea of planning is too much in league with the capitalists and does not allow for, the peasantry and for the workers, etc., for their interests to be taken care of. On the other hand, Visvesvaraya found the Nehruvian idea of planning too socialist. So there's a Fabian socialist kind of halfway house, which Nehru sort of represents. On the National Planning Committee, 1938, 1939, there's also Gandhian representative, who's J.C. Kumarappa, who's asking for something completely different. He's saying no large-scale industry, we must have village industries and so on. Then you have the Bombay Plan, of course, most famously in 1944-45, which is set up by industrialists like J.R.D. Tata, G.D. Birla, Lala Shriram, and all of these others, which is a kind of compromise formula. They see that planning is in the air, they see independence is in the air, they see that the state is going to play an active role, so they're going with it, but they're also saying that we, private capital, also need a role, so the government can take care of infrastructure and basic things, and we will take care of production and so on. So he's very much in support of that plan. He writes in support of the Bombay plan. He's not, in fact, it's a puzzle to me why he was not invited to be part of that group, because the people who were writing it were very well known to him, and but he did write an endorsement. The book I showed you here, 1944, Reconstruction Post-War India, was essentially an endorsement of the Bombay plan. And it's very true also that the Bombay plan was essentially an endorsement and updating of his 1934 plan. So the 2 or 3 major principles that come out from his work and which then gets reflected in the subsequent plans are the idea of having to calculate per capita income, how you calculate it, and how you set goals for doubling it or tripling it or whatever. And the other one was the idea of deficit financing. The idea that the government can and should incur debt for development projects, which will pay for themselves only in the long term. And he was saying this as early as the time of his divanship, right? When he was saying we need to spend money on building these dams and iron factory and so on. And there were very, very virulent critics at the time who were saying, no, this is a waste of public money because this is not a solid business proposition. It's not going to pay itself back. And then he has this wonderful rhetoric. There's a huge fight between him and a young Bengali finance officer in the Mysore government called J.S. Chakravarti. And they have these wonderful letters written back and forth to each other in great detail where they're taking digs at each other. And but with respect, of course, and they work together later. But Chakravarti is saying, if you put all of this money into these projects, what will happen if there's a famine? We'll have no liquid cash. We'll not be able to help people. And Visvesvaraya says, gone are the days when you can talk about balancing the budget on a year-to-year basis. Progressive countries everywhere operate on a deficit, right? So these ideas become very, very important later on in his career as a planner, and they're taken up. They are circulating in the environment, but he certainly gives it his imprimatur. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. So I'm quoting from Lionel Robbins, who was an economics professor at London School of Economics, and he says in 1937, planning is the grand panacea of our age. But unfortunately, its meaning is highly ambiguous. In popular discussion, it stands for almost any policy which it is wished to present as desirable. When the average citizen, be he Nazi or communist or summer school liberal, warms to the statement that, quote, what the world needs is planning, what he really feels is the world needs that which is satisfactory.
So, Mysore. What are the circumstances under which he ends up in Mysore? Tell us a little bit more about that. What are the highlights, so to speak, of his being the Diwan here? Because this is something that I think most people in this room are familiar, which is why I thought we would spend more time on the other aspects of his life and then towards the closing, bring us back to Mysore, which is just about a little bit far from here, a little distance from here compared to what we spoke about until now, after which we'll open up for question and answers. So please.
And of course, when we say Mysore, for him it was really Bangalore because he lived here. The offices were here, the public secretariat, which is now the High Court building. It was called Latara Kacheri at a particular time. And he was, as Diwan, he lived in Balabrui, the large, wonderful
Which you visited.
Which, yes, of course.
On your last trip.
Of course. And which was, and I think his time, there's just so much that one could talk about. The obvious things are very well known, and I think I'm not going to go into too much detail about the 2 big projects, because they are the best known. That's the KRS Dam and the Bhadravati Iron Works. Though if people have questions about them and want to know, I'm very glad to talk about it. I think some of the other things that are perhaps less emphasized, and the thing that was very impressive for me, was his real focus on primary education. And so when we say that he started a government engineering college, now UVC, people think, yes, okay, that makes sense. When you say he started industrial schools, but we don't immediately think of primary education. And he was really strong on this. Gokhale, his friend and mentor from Pune days, had tried to table a compulsory education bill in the Imperial Legislative Council a few years before, in the 1900s, the first decade of the 20th century. But it was not accepted because the colonial government said, we don't have the funds to do it, it costs too much money, people will not want to go to school, they will want their children to go to work in the farms and whatnot. But what could not be done in British India was to an extent done in Mysore, because there was a Compulsory Education Act. They started with a few centers where there was a law that people had to send their children to school. And then we see the statistics in year-on-year reports that these numbers of schools are increasing every year. It never becomes complete universal education. That's really difficult to achieve. But it is really quite remarkable how the numbers of enrollment increase. And these are all different types of schools. They are government-funded schools, government-aided schools, schools with matching donation from private individuals, all kinds of things. And also an emphasis on female education at this time, that girls should go to school. And in this, he is supported by H.V. Nanjundaya, who was part of his cabinet, so to speak, and who was in line to become Diwan when he became Diwan. But they saw eye to eye on a lot of things, and this was one of them. And so I think what is striking about his pronouncements at that time is the utter modernity of them. And I mean it in both senses, the normal sense in which we use the word modern, but also the historical sense of modern in terms of what it embodied in that period of the 20th century, right? The idea of the individual as the state and the individual having a direct relationship, not mediated by community or tradition and things like that. So he was not very keen on having, for example, religious education in schools. At one point he says, we will not remove it, but we will add business education, almost as if he's administering an antidote to the former. So and then the things he says about Mysore University when it's set up, he says, I don't want it to be somewhere, in a nice idyllic location, somewhere where people are cut off from the world. It has to be in the midst of what's happening, the hustle and bustle of everyday life. He's quite outspoken in his criticism of social practices, like the bad condition in which widows were treated at the time. So he was advocating widow remarriage. Of course, like his mentors, social reformers, he was advocating. He had some quite strong statements about the ills of the caste system, so he's very much looking for a fresh start, so to speak, where people absorb what he sees as the successes of the industrial West and create a modern, homogeneous Indian nation. So much so that somewhere even says, we can have uniform dress and we can, have uniform hours of work and so on and so forth.
That's interesting. It also reminds me of a utopia written in 1923 by Rahul Sankritya, which very much sounds like the kind of world that Visvesvaraya would like to have created. Before I ask our audience to also put their questions to you, let me ask you a bunch of what in common parlance are called rapid fire questions.
Is there
no. We'll have to ask Nazneen, but I'm happy to provide one. So first, who would you say? Now, obviously, the answer will exceed what I'm asking you by several, but try to see if one can. Okay. No, not the brief, but so like if I ask you for three, there will be 10, of course.
Oh, okay.
Right?
Got it.
So, who would you say are the three most important people around Visvesvaraya to understand his life?
Oh, that's tough. Let me think. Not in any order of importance, yeah. Right? Ranade.
More than Gokhale?
Perhaps more than Gokhale, okay. Because
that's interesting. Kind of,
yeah. D.V. Gundappa. And let's see, who else? Mirza Ismail.
Okay, lovely. What would you say? You can tell I love threes. 3 important things that he accomplished or completed as projects that we should remember that are not in common memory. The ones in common memory, like you already mentioned, are, one can put them aside. 3 other things that he accomplished, projects that he completed.
I can immediately think of 2. One is the primary education initiatives that I just mentioned, which, by the way, had very interesting things like, and of course, some of them predated him, but like Montessori training, a kindergarten system of education, something called the Swedish Sloyd system, which was a kind of vocational training for crafts and so on. The other thing which I really want to mention is the draft constitution that he wrote for India with a dominion status in the 1920s. Yes. And he didn't put his name to it. There are letters which show that Jayakar, his friend, asked him to draw this up. And he drew it up and he said, don't put my name to it. And Jayakar then tried to show it to the governor of Bombay and to labor politicians in Britain and others. And that this was asking for dominion status, in other words, for India to have full political autonomy and economic autonomy within the British Empire.
Yeah. So like Canada or
like
Australia.
Canada and Australia. So like Japan, the other big exemplars, the ones with which Visvesvaraya always compared India was Canada and Australia. So that if you're part of the British Empire, why are you having a different system for India as opposed to these 2 countries? And so this dominion system of government, he wrote this interesting, it was a fairly short document, but it was a document which went into great detail, you know, what should be the parliamentary system, how should delegates be treated. Delegates should be professionals, they should be paid salaries so that they are, you know, that they take their job seriously. But also there should be provincial autonomy because only provincial governments will know how to use the natural resources in their places fully for industrialization. And then the second half, this extraordinary rant against the excesses of British rule, which are all, you know, which show how he's getting progressively more outspoken in his critique as he's getting older. And he's talking about how they're jailing people for dissent. He's talking about how it's a, I think the phrase he uses is a watchman's government or something. In other words, that they're not really interested in long-term development. They're just here to maintain the status quo. He's talking about vested British business interests in India. And he's talking about how people should form clubs at district level, at village level. They should get together every Sunday and demand and make demands until they are met. Right? So there's this extraordinary document. But the key features of the first half, the constitutional document, actually quite similar to what later comes in the famous Nehru report, the Motilal Nehru report of 1927-28. And of course, then that has an impact on all that follows. And this is not surprising because he's very much a part of this same group of people who are forming what were called in the 1920s all parties conferences. So this is a group of people from different political backgrounds coming together to demand a solution to Swaraj, as they called it then, not complete independence necessarily, but self-government. And that brings me also to perhaps the most dramatic sort of, dramatic but less known moment in his career, Visvesvaraya's career, which happens in 1921 when there's something called the Malaviya Conference. And this is in the aftermath of Jallianwala Bagh, the repression in Punjab, lots of people jailed for sedition. The Montagu-Chelmsford reforms come in but are seen as inadequate. And the non-cooperation movement is about to start. And at this time, people like Malaviya and Jayakar, Jinnah at that time, and others who were middle of the road, not middle of the road, but who were sort of moderate Congress leaders, they wanted to find a constitutional solution. And so they tried to convene a national conference of people from all these different schools of thought. And Visvesvaraya was on the organizing committee. And they called all of these people, I think hundreds, maybe thousands, certainly hundreds of delegates from across the country. They met in Bombay in something called the Kawasji Jahangir Hall, which is this wonderful Gothic edifice with stained glass windows and so on. The same hall where Visvesvaraya got his engineering degree in 40 years earlier. almost 40 years earlier. And then there's this conference. Gandhi is participating, but not in a formal capacity. C. Shankaran Nair, lawyer come Congress leader, is the chairman. And he gets upset with the conditions laid down by Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi says, I will not call off non-cooperation movement unless, and he had a certain number of conditions, which Shankaran Nair thought were so extreme that the British would never meet them halfway, and therefore there would not be a roundtable conference. And so he stepped down, and Visvesvaraya was elected as chairman of the conference. So here you have an engineer, not a formal member of any political party, heading the foremost all-parties conference at a very crucial and tumultuous time in Indian nationalist politics. And I think that's a fantastic image.
Absolutely. The one thing that surprised you in his life story?
Well, at one level, the consistency. You see a lot of people changing their views rapidly on a number of things. He had a long time to change his mind, but he was remarkably consistent on the main tenets of his thinking. And this just reminds me of something you asked earlier. The ideas of New Deal and Soviet and other places. And as an engineer, is he thinking about development? Actually, he's thinking about development even as an engineer. It's clear because in the solutions he devises for irrigation in Bombay, especially his famous block system, which I tried to go into in some detail, it's clear that behind this system is a certain vision of how agriculture should function, which ties into his idea of what economic transition should occur, and the idea that we should move from subsistence to commercial farming and from there to industry and so on. But to come back to this, yes, so this consistency. I think the other is the kind of wry sense of humor, which comes through in anecdotes from family. Mr. Pandrinath wrote a wonderful book where he discusses the kind of exchanges he had with his grandnephews and grandnieces. And so there's the early, so he says that he used to recount this famous incident in Chicago where somebody, he offered an extra $1 to a tradesperson because he did very good service, and that fellow said, no, I will not take it, and gave it back. And so he would apparently say to his grandchildren, he would imitate that guy and say, I don't take anything that I don't, that's not owed to me or whatever. And then they said, yeah, but you don't give nothing that you that you have either, and stuff like that. And the fact that he would write these wonderful, these little digs in official reports. For example, when he's having this conversation with Chakravarti, the kind of, they're so subtle that you can miss them sometimes, but they're, you can tell. So the fact that he's finding time and the way of thinking to pack in these little asides. There are some other instances as well, which I'm not able to recall. Oh yeah, there's a famous one which I read about, where in a committee he's interviewing, the exact thing escapes me, so the impact will be lost. But there are, suffice it to say, that many instances where you can see that kind of that sense of humor, which doesn't come across in the standard image that you see emblazoned on walls and other places.
Okay. So the one story that I've heard again and again about him is that he would carry 2 ink pens in his pocket, one which was his own and one which belonged to the workplace. Is that true, or is it metaphorical?
Well, I don't know. The story certainly occurs very often. There are different versions. There's one which talks about official candles, one for after work time. There is certainly, we have eyewitness accounts of people who talk about the fact that he would not use his official car to transport family and so on. But I think what's important about these stories is the larger idea that they capture, which is that he clearly made this impact on the public mind. And this is again a very modern bureaucratic notion, right? The separation of the official and the personal, the separation of work and family. This is a time when you the personal and the professional blending into each other. The bureaucrats going to the Diwan's house before his time, going to their house and supplicating before them, asking for transfers and this and that. And he wants to make it very distinct. He wants to bring a new culture. So I think that's the symbolism that I read from those.
We haven't said much about his personal life, but I'm going to leave that to the audience to ask you. I'll end with one question. What has this historical figure come to mean to you as a person?
I think you can't spend, so many years with a person without sort of feeling that you have come to know them in some way. And so people around me know that at the drop of a hat, I will connect. Oh, Visvesvaraya said this about this, or this reminds me of something that Visvesvaraya said. And so certainly, a lot of experiences in my life, I now relate through what I know of his career. Because, one of the things that a biography or a synoptic history enables us to do is to see things with a bird's eye view. Right? You first dig into the details, and then you zoom out and look at the larger picture. And you can see things with a clarity that you can't see things that are happening around you immediately, for various reasons. One is that distance is useful. The other is that, archival research enables us to find facets which are hidden to us for contemporary things, right? Things which are declassified, things which are secret, personal letters that people wrote to each other, and of course, later deposited in archives, and so on. So I think, for example, if you think about, when I think about organizational issues, right? How does an organization function? How do leaders relate to people working with them? How do visionary leaders, operate? How do they get a buy-in for their view? How do sometimes they're not popular because people don't want to change the way they're working. Sometimes they are so interested in the end goal that they don't realize that people have a differing opinion. So all of these elements come through very clearly in a biographical exploration, and I think so that keeps coming back to me. I think the other thing that is interesting for me is this idea that this stark separation between a techie and a non-techie, the C.P. Snow's idea of the two cultures, doesn't really work. Doesn't really work, certainly for a figure like Visvesvaraya. And so
and for the many others that you and I have both studied.
For many others as well. And so I think that is something that I think of often. Yeah.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Let's open for questions. Yes. There are many, many, many questions.
Hi. Thanks so much for the talk. I really appreciate it. Just two questions. One, in terms of his attitude to industrialization, is it also one that goes side by side with urbanization? Is it a urban industrialization, or is it a kind of more rural, that can happen anywhere kind of industrialization? And secondly, if you can just take us through a little bit of maybe the thoughts around the time the linguistic states thing happens, and whether that is seen, how he squares that off with views of economic planning, industrialization, and so on, or the debates that are happening around linguistic states at that time.
Thank you. Should I wait for a few questions? Or? Yeah, okay.
Let's take a couple of questions more, and then we can let you answer.
Thank you. I'm sure you would have referred to this in your book, the issues pertaining to his parting of ways with the Maharaja. Do you think that kind of fits into his general, world view? Why do you think he was so against representative administration and so on? I seem to think that there's a certain disconnect with, you use terms like social reform and social things and so on. Would you agree that there's something in him that stands in sharp contrast with the rest of his worldview when you come to how he parted ways with the Maharaja and his views specifically on having a representative administration?
Are you referring to reservation in particular?
Yeah.
Okay.
Why was he against?
Okay.
So one more, and then I'll request Aparajit to answer.
Firstly, big congratulations, Aparajit, and thank you so much, Jahnavi, for navigating through this whole thing so beautifully. Just a simple, I just want to know that, considering that 60-70% of India is less than 35, how much of some of the great qualities that he had, which did so much in that kind of a period, how is it being utilized to say, help this young generation, or is it just names on metro railway station and things like that?
Okay, so I'll start with you. Thank you for the question. I think the first question is, well, his programs of industrialization talked about both urban and rural industrialization, both large scale and small scale industry. He talked extensively about the kinds of industries that should be there. There should be 2 basic industries in every province. Basic industry meaning things like iron and steel manufacturing, things that could then promote other industries. But then there should also be smaller industries for everyday needs and so on. And in fact, in the long debates by letter that he had with Mahatma Gandhi, that was one area where he tried to find a common theme, right? That they're both looking at cottage industries and so on. But I think my sense is that the fundamental difference is that he would have seen the rural industrialization as a stepping stone towards eventually moving towards an urban, a more urban society and large-scale industries. Your question about linguistic states, unfortunately, I have found no record of his views on this. This happens in the mid-50s, 1950s, by which time he's already in his mid-90s. He is quite active in public life at this time, but he's making a lot of statements on economic matters, as part of the All India Manufacturers Organization and so on. I have seen views on nationalization of industries and so on, but on linguistic states, I am not aware. I'm sure there probably is something, but I have not come across it. So on your question on reservation, I think in his mind there was no contradiction, because his idea was that social reform involved giving more opportunities, or making equal opportunities, or opening up more opportunities to a vast section of society. So his view was that by focusing on primary education, by focusing on scholarships for less advantaged sections of society, by creating all of these opportunities, then they could create a more level playing field at the basic level, and then that would translate to higher levels of, whether it's administration, whether it is college admission, or whatever it is. Now, today we look at this differently. Many people, there are still 2 sides of the debate. There's a strong debate for and against reservation. I think that, some of the arguments he made, maybe personally I would phrase differently. So the idea about, so he said, for example, we don't want, so he said that certain sections of people are doing well purely by dint of their hard work. So why should you disadvantage them, right? And that's true. People who were in the elite circles were doing very well. They were working very hard. They were accomplished. But we have to also acknowledge that we are, people in those sections may have been born with certain advantages, certain hereditary advantages. And so the question is, this is the standard debate about reservation, right? And we have different views on it. In his mind, reservation was something that that was a band-aid. It was a stopgap solution, and he wanted to address it from a more fundamental point of view. Now, given the state of politics at that time, where there's strong backlash against the domination of government jobs and other elite positions by the upper castes, that was not a position which was tenable politically, right? Because people wanted to see some symbolic action, and my understanding is that that the Maharaja and people around him, they had to show that they were doing something about those demands, and that was one major bone of contention. But it was not the only one. There were other things as well. And other than, I'm thinking now, Mirza Ismail was Diwan for 16 years, maybe, something like that, 14, 15 years. And he was a classmate of Maharaja Krishnaraj Wadiyar. But other than that, nobody served for very much long. Sheshadri Iyer maybe. But I think one way or another, it is likely that by 1920 or so, he would have moved on to other things. Sorry, the question was about yeah. Well, certainly, I think it should be definitely be more than names on metro stations, inspirational quotes, and things like that. And that's precisely what I'm hoping that we can do with this engagement, to get to know the person in more depth. And to understand, I think in history, to understand that things are not preordained. People take different decisions. They could have gone in a number of different directions. What would have happened if Visvesvaraya had not got a scholarship to study engineering at that particular time and had studied something else? It's an interesting question to ponder. And at that time, it's actually quite possible that it could have happened, because I came across some examples in the archives, the Diwan scholarship that was given at that time. And some people wanted to study engineering, and they said, oh, this is full, please give him a scholarship for agriculture instead, or the other way around. And people took it up, right? And then they went in a different direction. So I think the idea is to understand the many possible branches of a life, to understand the different possibilities, and to understand, how, and of course there are no direct lessons from history that we can download and use today, but to understand the different influences that go into the making of a life. And I think many of the lessons of history can only be internalized at a subconscious level and made part of our worldview, rather than saying, here's what you should do because so-and-so did this.
Yeah. So we have time probably for the last one question. So here you have someone.
Listening to you, we get a picture of a very perfect person. He's a great thinker, planner, able to get on with life, overcome whatever disadvantages he may have had. What was he as a human being? Did he drink? Did he have a dog? How was he as a good husband, good father? Did he beat his children? What did he do? Some understanding of that.
Well, no, he didn't drink. He was a vegetarian. He was a frugal eater, is what I have gathered. I believe he had dogs, right? He had, there's a very interesting account by his secretary in the 1940s who talks about a dog he had in his Bombay house, and how he dealt with visitors. So apparently he was quite skilled at fobbing off admirers who wanted to come and just talk to him without having anything serious to say. That's another instance where he could make quite cutting remarks about people who would just come and waste his time and so on. My sense is that he was a very serious person. Although he had a sense of humor, he had many friends, but they were all friends with whom he discussed ideas. I don't get a sense of people with whom he would let his hair down and just go and have fun at the end of the day and that kind of a thing. He worked incredibly long hours, and he was in fact a person who was always thinking about work in some form or the other. And so his closest sort of, the people with whom he interacted most in terms of letters and other things that we can see, they were really talking about ideas and reforms and so on. He was married early in his life. The first 2 times his wife died in childbirth when he was in his 20s. He was married a 3rd time and separated. But from the age of about 30 to the age of 100, he was single. And had these large palatial houses, which were partly offices, and so on. And he also divided his time between Bombay and Bangalore for much of his later life. So I think he filled his some of that gap with work, with travel, with these long journeys abroad, exploration, and so on. What else was he like as a person? I think there's sorry? No direct children, but his grandchildren are here. He lived with, and that's because he lived with the family of his brother's son and their children later in his life. Mr. Satish is here, who was I think around 10 at the time when he was in his when he started living with you, or you were younger. Right. Okay. So you were 7 at the centenary, so I think he had that experience late in his life, in the last sort of 10 years of his life. But in between, he didn't live with direct family. But I was going to say something else about as a boss, right? He was a kind of he was respected, he was loved, but people also had a tough time, some of them, right? Because he was really a perfectionist. He wanted people to do things in a particular way. I told you the anecdote about long hours and so on. There's one particular person whose diary we have access to, and of course it's a one-sided account, but he goes on and on and on about what Visvesvaraya said to him, and he wanted him to do what he called take initiative. So not just process files, but do something new. And this person didn't understand what he meant by this. What is this something new that I'm supposed to do? So I think those exchanges are very interesting. But what's really interesting in that is this person is a bureaucrat called Srinivasa Iyengar, and he writes about this in his diary. And but he also says that he would get criticized in the morning, but later he would be called and there would be some kind of mollifying statement made. So, Visvesvaraya felt that in some way he had to be kind to him. But he got more confused because, does he not like me or does he like me? So I think as a person to work with, people really had to change some of their preconceived notions to be able to work with him.
Thank you, Aprajit, for this absolutely fabulous sharing with us the life of this wonderful person. I think we get a sense of an incredibly global figure, a person who's with his times, and as I said, in aspects actually well ahead of his time, a person who is politically heavily involved and yet technically very competent. And I think it speaks also to a generation where we do find figures comparable to him. By comparable, I don't necessarily mean in terms of accomplishment, but although they are. But figures who are of a particular time when thinking beyond the profession and thinking of the purpose of the profession in national life was sort of the zeitgeist, right? If you think of Meghnad Saha, if you think of the many other, if you think of Homi J. Bhabha, if you think of Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar, if you think of Prashanta Chandra Mahalanobis, these are people who are sort of at the cutting edge or at the frontier, if nothing else, of their own technical professional fields, are thinking about what their work means for the place they're born in and they live, and it's very funny when you speak about him as having friends who he exchanges ideas with and is otherwise sort of recalcitrant, taciturn, difficult with people around them, right? And if you see accounts of Chandrasekhar Venkatraman, it's very similar, and so on and so forth, right? So I think there's a quality, there's a density to the figures of this time, which we also find in him, and yet there is something so specific to each of them, and so to him as well. And as an engineer, I think it is difficult to find a comparable figure across such a expanse of time and the kinds of roles he occupied and the functions he served. Thank you for bringing him to life for us, and thank you for writing this fabulous book. As I already said, it's written in a very, very elegant manner. It's lovely to read. So I encourage those of you who have not the opportunity yet to read it, please read it. Thank you again, and thank you for your questions.
Thank you, Jahnavi. Thank you to everyone. Thank you for doing it.